Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is good to see you here. If you have drifted in and aren't here for the End of Life series, we're glad you're here anyway, and I trust that you will enjoy or benefit from our time. If you're just here for breakfast, please do keep eating. If you'd like another cup of coffee, help yourself. Today is the second of a 3 Sunday morning series on preparing for finals, getting ready for end-of-life issues. And you might have been expecting for Father Chuck and Kim Smith to be up here, but we needed to do a little swap, and so Hershey and I are here to talk about medical end-of-life issues from the medical perspective, and next week Kim and Father Chuck will be here to talk about legal issues. So I hope you're not too disappointed by that, but welcome. Let's start our time with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, you know us and you love us and you call us by name even before we are born, through this whole life long and into our next life. Fill us with faith and confidence that as we journey with those we love toward the end of life, we might be filled with peace and hope and comfort that come from you. Through Christ our Lord, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
A couple of housekeeping bits, and then we'll spend most of our time listening to Dr. Garner, and then from us as well, as you'll ask questions. There is a sign-up sheet by the door on a clipboard for our Saturday workshop. That's the first Saturday in October. There's no charge to come, but we are providing lunch, so please let us know whether or not you will be there. Also, if you have any dietary restrictions, indicate those to us or somehow get us that information, because I'd hate to provide a lunch that you are unable to enjoy. But that workshop, the first Saturday in October, starts around 9:30 and will last until around 3. If you can only come for part of it, we're still glad that you can come from part of it, but I hope you'll be able to come and join us for the whole time. We'll have 4 different presentations on legal, medical, and funeral planning, so I hope you'll be there for that. Last week, we talked about starting the conversation and why having the conversation is important, and we provided a little handout packet, the same one that we've been providing for a number of weeks in anticipation of this series. And remember that that packet, and indeed the work that we're doing, is not designed to answer all your questions. It's designed to help you start a conversation with your loved ones, a conversation with your attorney, a conversation with your medical providers. And so that handout is just to get things started. Before you leave today, I'll have another handout for you. This one is assuming that you've had the conversation with your family. How do you talk to your doctor? So take one of those with you when you go, because that might be a good resource for you as you continue. Any questions about the logistics of our series, about where we are or where we're headed? All right. Well, welcome. Well, welcome to you, Hershey. I'm glad that you're here. I heard yesterday that Denise's mother died, Helen, and she's in our prayers, as is Denise, and we're sorry for that. We're glad that you're here with us today, even though. Tell us, if you would, about yourself and what kind of medicine you practice, and let us know a little bit about you, please.
I will do that. Can everyone hear me? Once or twice a week, I have someone ask me, "Doc, am I going to die?" That is not the question they want an answer to. I tell them, in our holy literature, only 2 people have gotten out of this life without dying, and I'm pretty sure you and I are not going to be 3 and 4. So the question is not if, but when. And most of the time we don't know when or exactly how. But what they're wanting to know is, what do I need to do before that happens? I'm Hershey Garner. My background is in physics, finance, law, and medicine. And my hospice work began about 20 years ago. I got here 30 years ago working with cancer patients, and then worked into the hospice work because half the folks that I work with die while we're working with them. There was an opening on the board of Circle of Life, and about 20 years ago, they asked me to be on their board. Since we had a natural connection, I did. They lost their medical director, and we were sitting around at a board meeting, and I was the only one who could not step back when they said, okay, we've got a hole we've got to plug. So I became the medical director for a period of years, and then the organization blossomed, and now they have a full, robust medical staff. So I still work with both Washington Regional's hospice organization and Circle of Life, but have stepped back and am tangentially involved with board work, ethics committee work, and as a referral.
Would you be willing to say a little bit more, not just the overlap between work as a radiation oncologist and hospice care? Is there anything else about the nature of hospice care or the work that you've done with Circle of Life that keeps you connected? Is there something else about that work that sort of fulfills you and your calling?
The beauty, just from a healthcare model, there is no model that is as team-oriented in healthcare in this country as hospice. It involves everyone in the care of the patient. The patient is sort of the hub of that wheel, and medical assistants, social workers, nurses, doctors, chaplains, everybody at family, all are involved in that. And that is very attractive to have everybody taking part in those decision-making times. And it is a place to which we all go. Not everybody will get an infectious disease, not everybody will break a bone, not everybody will get cancer, but everyone will make this journey. And how we do that and the things we have to do are critically important to deal with, and we have not historically done that well in this country. Hospice has been around in terms of both that term and care of the dying for about 1,000 years. Started in the Middle Ages when the Crusaders would have places where folks who were travelers, injured in war, dying, had a place to go away from community, because a lot of times the communities eschewed them as something wrong. They're broken, get them out of here before we get what they've got. So hospice began there and kind of percolated along for 1,000 years, and then an incredible woman, Saunders. Cecile Saunders. Two things happened in the 60s. You might remember, for those of us who were alive then, there were several things going on in the 60s that were transformative. Many of them I do not remember, but two things I do. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book on death and dying from a psychiatric health caregiver standpoint. And Dr. Saunders, out of England, came out of World War II as a nurse, became a physician. In the mid-60s, started dealing with death and dying, did a year at Yale in the mid-60s, I think, where they talked about, okay, what we discovered was we needed to aggregate all these dead and dying people in hospitals and keep them there, but most people did not want to die in a hospital, but in the 60s, almost everybody did unless it was a car accident. So what they were looking at in the mid-60s was, how do we meet this need? And Dr. Kubler-Ross and Dr. Saunders went back to their respective continents, and in about 50-something years ago now, in the late 60s, Dr. Saunders established the first model for what we now, how most Western cultures do hospice care. So that model was the team concept where everybody's involved. You have a different set of goals, and it has really morphed into something that I think meets a need.
Would you say some more about those goals? How are the goals of hospice care different from the goals of perhaps traditional or mainstream? I don't want to say hospice isn't mainstream, but before you get to hospice, how are the goals different? How do they change?
Well, the goals are very different. As technology has advanced exponentially, we have a lot of breaks we can fix, and as I mentioned, the elephant in the room that we can't. And we spend so much time, energy, and money trying to fix things, and hospice addresses that time where you are not prolonging life, you are prolonging death. And so the hospice issue is how do we make this natural part of the circle of life therapeutic for the patient and their loved ones. I worked, Toby, as you get older, names do not come around as quickly. That random access memory gets more random with less access. But Toby was a chaplain in the Mercy system in Springfield, and we did a lot of work about 15 or 20 years ago on medical ethics issues. And as hospice was coming into its own both here and in Springfield. And Toby's idea was, and I've seen bits of it in other places, but he said the purpose of hospice is to allow 5 things to happen. And the first time I heard him say that in a conference, I thought he was hearkening back to Dr. Kubler-Ross's The 5 Phases of Grief. But he said, in hospice, we want to allow time for the patient and their families to do 5 things. You want the patient to be able to say, be in that place where these 5 tasks can be checked off. I forgive you, I'm sorry, thank you, I love you, goodbye. All of those things need to happen for the patient to turn loose and the family to grieve and move on. And that's what we try to create in hospice. And if you are taking those resources, both physical and time and energy from the patient, trying to defeat that which is not defeatable, instead of dealing with those things that are, you have what is not a good death, both for the patient and for their loved ones.
Is it always clear when it's time to switch to hospice? I presume that at times that can be ambiguous, and if you'd say something about how when you meet with families or when you talk to other colleagues, how do you have a conversation with a patient or with a family about making the choice to pursue hospice?
We don't do that very well in this country. We have, we don't take advantage of hospice nearly as early in the process as we should. In the 70s, when hospice sort of got geared into the Medicare insurance-based model, we decided that hospice would be appropriate when a person has a condition which will limit their life to 6 months or less. So you can usually get pretty close to that. When people ask me that question, when am I going to die or am I going to die, they usually want some time frame. We are not very good at that. We can usually say if it's going to be hours, days, weeks, months. And sometimes that's not good enough. So the thing I use is this process likely to be the cause of their death? And then if it is, at what point have we exhausted any realistic options of altering that timeline? And when you hit that point, then you really need to move from that prolonging the death process into how we therapeutically deal with the end of life.
Without speaking about particular colleagues or institutions, do you sense that there are those in the medical field who aren't gifted at making that transition, at naming that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The
patient has to be involved in that, and their families. Because one of the things that, with hospice and end-of-life issues, more than any other healthcare crisis we face, the patient is the center of that. It's the center of that process. They need to be the focus all of the time.
I've heard the term palliative care. Would you talk at all? Is there a difference between palliative care and hospice care? And in general terms, what are those differences?
There is a difference. They are both boarded the same now. But palliative care can be anywhere along your health care continuum, wherever you are. Hospice is specifically limited to those end-of-life issues. Palliative care specialists spend their time with figuring out how to deal with the symptoms you're experiencing with the least impact on your daily activities of life.
Okay. A couple more questions, then we're going to hear from y'all. You mentioned a minute ago that hospice care, more than any other aspect of healthcare, is patient-centered. The patient must be involved in that. In your work, both with hospice and with other healthcare, are there any requests or hopes or issues that you hear frequently from patients? What do you hear or what do you notice from those with whom you're offering care? What are the things that they name in terms of the kinds of considerations or decisions they might make as they start to make plans for their own end of life?
Control. They want to have as much control of the process as they can. And that's one thing that Dr. Saunders really helped us with 50 years ago, and we are not as far along as we should be. If you ask folks, about 80% of people do not want to die in the hospital. About 80% of people do die in the hospital. We are failing miserably at that. But they want to be home. They want to have some control in how they spend those last days. They want to be able to engage. They want not to be suffering. And we can meet most of those needs if everybody is paying attention.
Is it helpful to have conversations ahead of time?
Surely. It is critical.
Right? Say about that. So, I mean, why is it so critical?
Well, because as I said, when you've got the patient as the hub of that wheel, you've got to know what the patient wants. And in terms of medical ethics, dating back 2,000 years, the most important thing in terms of making ethical decisions in healthcare is patient autonomy. What does the patient want? And the only way to know that is to ask the patient and let them express in writing, hopefully, or at least verbally to their loved ones, this is what I would want. What is important to me? We have to extrapolate that in a lot of cases after the patient is no longer able to give us those answers.
But presumably, if that patient has had a conversation with medical staff or with family, or maybe even particularly with a healthcare agent, that changes the way that y'all are able to honor that person's wishes.
We make informed decisions.
And if what a patient wants is control, even when that patient is not able to speak for herself, how important it is to honor that desire for control, whether it means to be completely involved or completely detached. But for the patient to be able to be in control of those sort of meta decisions is possible by having that conversation early on. Okay.
It's critical.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing that would give us more control than we have, and this is an aside completely, but we have 8 jurisdictions in this country that have death with dignity statutes. Arkansas doesn't, but it was brought up in our last legislative session. To allow the patient to determine when life is no longer life for them is important, but you have to have those discussions. There was a wonderful, there's a nice video called How We Die in Oregon that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. Several vignettes in there are informative for me, but one of them, when California was drafting their death with dignity statutes, they had a couple, one who had ALS, and the model now is that if you want ultimate control into when you die and how, you have to be able to request it 3 times. You have to be able to be the agent of that proximal cause of your death. There are several constraints on it, but this couple, the woman with ALS, having difficulty speaking, was asking the California legislature, please do not adopt the Oregon model, which requires those 3 components to be able to deliver the medication themselves and to ask 3 times. She said she had been with her partner for about 10 years. She said, I love her deeply, and I would like to be able to spend as much time with her as I can, But what you are setting up will require me to end my life 6 months to a year before I would normally want to, but I will not be a burden to my partner. So we have not gotten that far yet. Why that is so difficult, I'm not sure. But the patient, the point is the patient needs to be the one to decide what life is for them and when the burden of life exceeds the benefit.
And in some way, circling back around, I want to respond to that by asking if you would speak to us about the extent to which, and perhaps not at all, you as a physician feel conflict between the thought of facilitating someone's death with dignity or even having a conversation about planning for death. Why is or is not there any conflict in you when you're having a conversation with someone about, at least in our case, in not enabling death, but certainly honoring death that's coming? How do you deal with those? Surely there's some kind of heal versus not. Talk about that.
Well, it depends on what you mean by heal.
Sure.
And what you mean by life. And once again, that goes back to the four principles of medical ethics, or patient autonomy, which is always primal. Beneficence is what you're suggesting going to be of help. The fourth one is harm, is what you're suggesting if it will not help and the patient wants it, will it hurt them? And then the fourth, those first three factors of medical ethics are all centered around the patient. The fourth is justice. Is this just to the system as a whole? And that's something we're going to have to grapple with as we age. And having just experienced it with Denise's mom, we are spending so much of our healthcare dollars on the end of life. We cannot afford to do that as a society. We cannot force existence on people who do not want it at a cost we cannot afford. So I got off track. That didn't answer the question.
That's okay.
What was the?
But do you feel conflict with honoring your ethical obligations and having a conversation with somebody about end of life?
Oh, no. I
Yeah,
don't.
say
Because they get to determine what their life is, and my task is to help facilitate for them what they consider life and to make that process as therapeutic for them as we can. And there comes a time where it's kind of like praying. You don't always get what you ask for, but if you're in the right place, you get what you need.
Yeah.
There's a song in there somewhere from the 60s, but I can't remember it. So no, if the patient, and patients have been asking me this for over 30 years. And one comes to mind, a close friend when we were in Kentucky, had end-stage colorectal disease. And he was a dignified, completely in control of his entire life gentleman. And he could not abide the thought of his wife and son changing his diapers. For him, that was the thing he focused on for the last 6-8 months of his life. And he had narcotics at his bedside. And the last conversation we had together was, how much of this can I take if I'm really hurting? And we sat and spent time together, and I knew what his question was. So we have been doing that, but putting an undue burden on the patient to ask the question that is not going to put me in a bad position, but is going to give them the information they need. And one patient that we had in hospice that really kind of stirred our mix, we had a gentleman who had been in the Strategic Air Command in Europe and had spent 20 years there, retired from the Strategic Air Command and stayed in Germany teaching, developed a pancreatic malignancy, which is one that you generally do not recover from unless you're a Supreme Court justice in your 80s, then you get over it. But he clearly was not. So he moved back to Northwest Arkansas because this is where his home was. And he said in our first team meeting at hospice, he said, I want you to know that I don't want any other treatments. I want to be comfortable and functional, and when I am not, I want to die. That was his ground rules. And he had this wonderful analytic math kind of mind, and his notion of functioning was he had this thing which would come up on his computer every morning, which were math mind problems. And when his notion was, when he couldn't score a certain set on that, his mind was going and he was done. So we had a urgent called meeting one morning with the nurse that had been out there and said, we have to limit his narcotics. He is suicidal. And I had just seen him the week before. I said, something has changed because he wasn't. And she laid out this scenario that he was going to kill himself if he quit functioning or started hurting and we weren't controlling it. So we talked, and he had the most beautiful way of doing it. He didn't, but he had mapped out this plan. So he had figured out when he was not functioning like he wanted to or we weren't controlling his pain, he loved opera. He had calculated the volume of his garage and the CO2 output of his car. So when his life, for him, as he defined it, was over, he had talked to his neighbor. He was going to leave a note on his neighbor's door that said, would you get my paper today? And he would leave his garage door opener there. He had calculated the time his car would need to run to put himself out. He would have that much gasoline in his car. He would start his car in the garage, put on his favorite opera, and would not wake up. And I said, clearly, and he said, I want you to know I will not shoot myself because of what that would do to my kids, and I will not overdose on narcotics because I know that would have a lot of paperwork for you guys. So this is what I'm going to do. I said, this guy is not suicidal. He is brilliant. And as it turned out, he succumbed to his disease, comfortable and cognitive, which was what he wanted.
I hear a changing of the conversation.
I'm sorry, I did.
No,
I've
not
read about
that.
that.
But I mean, in terms of the care that you're providing, you're changing a conversation from death to be avoided at all costs to how can we honor the life of this patient as that life approaches the end.
That's it.
Yeah. So of course there's no ethical conflict with that. Yeah.
No.
Let me ask one more question, then I want to open it up. Are conversations with patients and families about end-of-life issues ever difficult? I presume they are. And if so, what are some of the things that you offer? Some words, some direction, some framework that helps in a difficult, if indeed it is difficult, that helps get where we need to go in that conversation. How do you manage those conversations?
Two things about that. Everybody is so different. So it depends on where the patient is. And in the South, particularly the Bible Belt South, Western Christianity has given us some very unhealthy notions about magic. So a lot of patients will come in wanting magic. And I had one a year or so ago who had had a tough life and was certain because she had had a difficult life, she was where she was. And God was not answering her prayers to be healed because she had been horrible as a young person. But her sister, who had always been a good person, was coming up from Texas. She was going to pray for her, and God would answer her sister's prayers. What a horrible way to approach the end of life, thinking you are going to that sort of petty, vindictive God. So where is the patient is the first question. You never take that away from them. I mean, if they think there is magic out there, you honor that, even if it's not what you believe. So you just say, okay, what can we deal with? How do we keep you comfortable? So what does the patient want? What is important to them? What is going to sustain them in those times? And then the other issue, where most of the time the issue comes to the ethics committee is not when the patient is still cognitive and engaged, but when the patient is not responsive and you've got family members who have a disagreement as to what ought to happen. And that's when you get into, if the patient didn't leave specific instructions, okay, what did your mom say was important? Was her garden important? I mean, how big a part did that play? Was music, what did she view as affecting the quality of her life? And then you have to piece together what's important. and get the family all on board. And that can be a very difficult dynamic when part of the family's been here taking care of the loved one. The part of the family that's been removed for 10 years flies in from California and knows exactly what needs to happen. And getting those voices together can be really difficult. But you just take it slow and easy. And I had, about 6 weeks ago, we had a patient in a county to the north of us who we had that dynamic. And their preacher, when we had these ethics committee meetings, we usually have the healthcare team involved. We have as many of the family as we can have there. And this woman, the primary caregiver, the wife, was a member of a very fundamentalist Pentecostal church. And when she brought her preacher in, I thought, oh my goodness, this is not going to go well. And we had been talking about 30 minutes. And the preacher had moved from we just got to invoke the divine. We've got to put this in God's hands. And he was coming from where I thought he would be coming from. And after about 30 minutes, when the intensivist had talked about what was in store for the patient in the coming weeks, the Pentecostal preacher reached over to the wife and put his hand on her arm and called her by name and said, he used that term which had come up earlier, I think we're just prolonging his dying, and that's not right. And it was just, and it was the release that the wife needed to say, oh, so I don't have to wait for this magic to happen. Maybe the magic is calm, comfort, not being in the unit, not being on a ventilator, just being quiet and in the room.
So you do not only yourself a favor, but especially your family a favor.
Absolutely.
By having this conversation, by expressing your wishes in some form or another, and also trusting that having had that conversation, expressed those wishes, that those who are caring for you will honor those wishes. Yeah, thank you.
We did have one case, just a brief,
Yeah.
Unintended consequences. I, for a while, was on the ethics committee for the National Hospice Organization, and we have monthly meetings, and the former Pope, not Ratzinger, Pope.
John Paul?
No, the one to right. Not Francis, the one
Benedict.
before that.
Benedict.
Okay, Benedict. Issued a letter that said essentially in Catholic healthcare facilities, you always must err on the side of life. So if there is any question, any ambiguity, you must err on the side of life. And so we viewed that as a significant problem, so we had this called meeting to discuss how we were going to deal with our Catholic institutions who might view this differently. And one of the members on that committee teaches at a Catholic university in Boston, said, oh, I understand y'all think this is going to be an issue, but it's not. The way we practice healthcare, they understand what the Pope means, and they understand the realities of healthcare on the ground. That was at our called meeting on Tuesday. On Friday, we get a called meeting to deal with a large Catholic hospital in Tulsa, where an elderly woman had been in an auto accident, brain dead, on a ventilator in the Catholic hospital with an advance directive that says, I do not want any life-sustaining interventions. And a son whose priest had just told them the Sunday before, the Pope has said that you must err if there's any ambiguity on the side of life. And the son says, what I know is my mother loved the Pope, she loved her faith, she loved her priest, and if she knew this, if she knew the Pope said you need to err on the side of life, she wouldn't have wanted this to happen. Wow. The son was the only spokesperson that the mother had. All we had was what the mother said she wanted. And that brings in, so it's not always perfect.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
No, that's okay.
ran down another rabbit hole.
Let's Peter, would you mind helping pass the microphone around? What questions might y'all have? Chuck and Peter are going to help with questions. How did that story end?
The hospital did not, and the ethical framework that we had to work in, and we did talk to other family members who were not the healthcare proxy, who said, this was what is important. We think she would not want to be alive like this. So that's what the National Ethics Committee said, was you've got to honor her advance directive. The hospital said, no, we will not. We will keep her on the vent. And it got a little bit involved over the next 7 days, and it wound up getting her transferred to a non-Catholic hospital that would honor her wishes. But there was the bump in the road where the hospital was not even going to transfer her if they wouldn't keep her on life support, and we dissuaded them of that notion.
So it's not always clear, and we talked about this last time. It's never just one conversation.
No.
We always have this conversation. It's not like you can, if you have this conversation today, you never have to worry about it again. That's not true. You're always having this conversation because you change, the environment around you changes, medicine changes, and it's good to continue to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. What questions do y'all have for Dr. Garner, for Hershey? Cynthia, right behind you.
What would be your advice to us as walking, healthy people? What would you have us to do to make it easier for our family members, for the group, and for ourselves? What do we need to write down, or where do we need to put it or say?
There are some very good, in fact, the materials on this conversation starters are a good resource to use. Write down what's important to you. What is your quality of life? Is it important that you be able to engage with family? Is it important for you to be able to walk around? How functional do you need to be to have what you define as life? And then lay those things out. And there's a smorgasbord you can choose from. I don't want artificial feedings. I don't want ventilation. I don't choose it. You can decide how much intervention you want, and you can change that as circumstances change. But have a discussion, and I've had this discussion with my boys. Sometimes they think I'm further along than I think I am, but they've respected my wishes so far. But let them know and have that discussion go on as life situations change.
At the workshop on Saturday, Malcolm Hayward will be with us, and he'll present kind of not this Saturday, but the first Saturday in October, he'll present a worksheet where you can sort of have that conversation. I think it's important, and Kim Smith and Father Chuck will talk about this next week. It's important to know that you've expressed your wishes in a way that can be received. Certainly, if there's ever a conflict between a family member and a hospital and a pope, you want to make sure that you've got the right documents taken care of, including perhaps the healthcare agent. But we'll talk a little bit about the legal part next week, and then the workshop will go through some of those considerations. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Ruth Ann. Hold on a second. Do you have to have everything written down, or can you just communicate it to another person?
It is helpful if everything's written down. That will prevent you, if you have that and you have a major medical event in the hospital, it can prevent you from being in the unit on a ventilator. If it is not written down, then it's important that we, as the ethics committee at the hospital, be able to be your advocate for what you wanted, and the only way we can know that is by talking to your family members with whom you talked before you were debilitated. So they're both important. Having it codified in a written document is the best, but have those discussions as you're formulating what it is you want.
If you never share it with your family, but you have it written down, and when that child opens that envelope and sees what they don't expect to see, there can be a real conflict. That can't be what my mother wanted, because we've always imagined my mother would never want that.
Exactly.
So it's not. It might be good enough to have it written down, but so much better to have shared your wishes with family so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, exactly. They're supportive and can help facilitate what you wanted.
Thank you. Other?
This is part of the conversation, and part of the conversation is to share with someone else. So even if it's not written down, if you have shared it with someone else, You're taking part of the conversation, and that's what this whole thing is about, starting the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
If you write it down, it's not part of a will because you're not dead. So where do you write it down?
It's in, there are forms which are codified in every state jurisdiction, advanced directives.
So actually, and if you Google, if you Google Arkansas Advanced Directive, you'll get like 40 different versions of the form. But the actual State Department of Health has a official form for Arkansas. There are other forms that, of course, work. But if you want to know, at least that one will work. You can find that on the web, and we'll offer those on that Saturday as well. Yeah. Jim.
The standard cookbook healthcare directive is very nondescript.
Yeah.
There needs to be much more.
It's on. Really close.
Anyway, there needs to be much more information than what you typically take and file at the hospital or with your physician.
There does, and a lot of the forms have that on it. And one of the ones I saw on the website was fairly detailed.
Yeah, so sometimes the forms that you get from healthcare providers aren't detailed enough. So you've got to make sure that the forms that you complete do a good enough job of expressing your wishes, or else there's so much ambiguity that, again, we feel powerless. Thank you, Jim. Other questions or comments? Yeah, Peter.
There's a big difference between people wanting to die at home versus where they actually pass. How do you solve that inherent conflict of, I'd love to die at home, but I don't want to be a burden on my family?
That is difficult, and I think that's a conversation we need to have way before we get to those end stages. And there are some really primitive notions about that, about having someone die at home, that I remember my parents and their family, it was very common to have somebody die at home and then be viewed at home before the burial. Now we have sanitized it as we, for 3 generations, have decided this needs to happen in the hospital. And hospice is very good at that, about having those discussions with the family about why this is natural. It's perfectly reasonable for the children to be able to be aware something's happening, so grandpa doesn't just vanish into a black box and then is never seen or heard from again. So there are therapeutic ways to handle that, but the conversation is how you do that.
Yeah, and the logistical conversation, right? You know, if it's your wishes to stay at home, even if it's your wishes to have a visitation, a viewing at home, you need to have that conversation well in advance, right? So that we can talk, so that the person you're having the conversation with can say, well, how are we going to bathe you? Like, I'm not strong enough to do that. So that what are home health care options? And it takes a while. It takes time to ask those questions and find the answers. And it's difficult to have that conversation when the end of life feels close, because then emotions and logistics are all too close to us. So good to have that conversation early. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yes.
With the approach that the patient is as much as possible in charge of making the decisions, how about in the cases where the patient has dementia, Alzheimer's?
Usually, if they have an advanced directive, that's very helpful. You know what was important. If they don't, then the discussions they've had with family members are important. And then in the end, if you don't have family who has any idea or input, and the patient has no idea or input, that fourth component of justice comes into play. And there's the healthcare system is not required to render, and in fact, and from an ethical standpoint, is prohibited from delivering futile care. Because that is not something you are doing for a patient, it is something you are doing to a patient. So if you get to that point where you have a non-responsive patient with skin breakdown, decubitus ulcers, those sorts of issues which, if there's a sensation, it ought to be unpleasant and no hope of turning that around, then what we need to do is just support that patient. So in the end, that justice overlay can come into play where you have to look at, based on what we do know, is this just?
Pick up one of these on the way out. This does not deal with that particularly, but this website, and there's information in here, they have a separate conversation starter for how do you have this conversation with and about someone who's suffering from dementia. And if you go to that website, you can easily find it's free. You can download it, you can print it out. If you have any difficulty with that, I'd be happy to provide that for you or for anybody who would like. Again, it doesn't answer the question, but it helps you frame that conversation with the individual and with other caregivers. Yeah. Other questions? We've got time for 2 or 3 more, depending on how long it is. Right in front of you, Chuck. Oh. Go ahead, Shannon. Shannon first, and then we'll come back up here. Probably not.
Do not resuscitate, a DNR, which I've heard you're like supposed to have somewhere like, so the EMTs show up at your house and basically you don't want them to do anything if it's too severe. I mean, do you have to have that like taped on your front door, or how does that work?
It is much easier for our hospice patients because we have a specific DNR form that is taped on the door of the room where the patient is living. Most of the time that works. It is trickier if you have handwritten on a piece of notebook paper DNR. They will resuscitate you if that's all you've got on your door. So there's a specific form that needs to be filled out to relieve EMTs of the responsibility of reviving you.
Thank you. Last question right here.
I was just wondering about trying to get large families all on board because from all different parts of the country, somebody's taking care of this person, and there's been some close conversations. Things are written down, but like you said before, something, comes in from California and they know exactly what's happened, but possibly not what's happened in the preceding month or two.
How do you get large families together?
It's just a matter of time and presence. You've just got to spend time talking with them. Most of the time, if you spend enough time, you lay the predicate, you can all reach a reasonable outcome.
Thank you. Let's say thank you to Dr. Garner. Hershey Garner, thank you. Thank you, Hershey. Thank you very much. And before you leave, pick up one of these. Next week, Kim Smith on legal issues. And if you're coming to the Saturday workshop, please sign up for us. Thank you.